And the next speaker will speak about legal aspects related to the topic of morals and values. And this is Professor Yaffa Zilbershats. Professor Zilbershats, she's from the Faculty of Law at Bar-Ilan University. She was recently a chair, and she joined this institution recently.
I think maybe from Zion, Torah will come out. And first of all, I'd like to start with something general and to connect to what you said, Yishai, about the idea of a UN, who cares? Namely, the international law is not taken seriously by Israel in the first decades of its existence, and that was a boomerang. It was wrong because in the scroll of independence, specifically in the League of Nations, we committed to actually abide by the UN covenant, and it includes all the moral and ethical aspects of the international law, complete forbidding of using force, and also human rights and protection and the centrality of the human. It's important that the international law would be universal for all. So I will answer the question. Yes, our national resilience, of course, we have to abide by universal law that have to do with ethics and with morals. However, and this is something that I think is important to focus on, I think that we have to recognize exactly what does the international law says in order to create the distinctions of what actually moves us. Namely, the word human rights and no use of force. These are very good things to protect refugees, but they're not enough in order to be something comprehensive that doesn't have the spectrum between things that were really forbidden by the law and those that the law doesn't actually specify. And sometimes, because of lack of knowledge or populism, you say, yes, but it doesn't abide by the international law because it says that or the other. In order to illustrate what I'm saying in the context of the Ukraine, the importance of the universal law and the usage of it, let me relate to three questions that were raised, and they are very different from one another. The two relevant questions regarding the international law which connect between Israel and the Ukraine is also the use of force. Is Israel committed by the international law or is forbidden to participate together with Ukraine and help it with its war? The second one is the question of refugees who came here and asked for refuge. These are two questions that create interaction of ethical issues and the international law, and they're relevant in the relationship between Israel and the Ukraine. And also I'll relate to the third question that Professor Ber mentioned that has no connection to the interaction, but it does come up regarding the war, and that is protecting our needs and all the delicate issues that have to do with war. As for the use of force, and Professor Halbertal, I agree with what you said. The international law forbids use of force, but it does allow it if you protect yourself and in cases of legitimacy that the Security Council of the UN said because it's a danger to the peace of the world. In the case of Russian and Ukrainian war will not happen because they cannot pass a resolution that uses force against Russia as long as the UN is constructed the way it is. And self-protection, the state of Israel is not in danger, so it's not committed. Although there is a collective self-protection. If a state is threatened, then other countries can help it, but they don't have to. And I think that in this case also there are certain considerations of the state of Israel, and they integrate with the decrees of international law, and they don't compel the state of Israel to help Ukraine. Is it clever to do it? Should it do it? That's already other questions. but they're not a question of law, of the legal aspect. The law gives the spectrum. It is not compelled, and also it is not forbidden. It's not a violation of the UN decree, and there are various considerations, and we have to understand them to know what I require from the international law. Also, the refugees. We have to know the issue very well. According to international law, actually, they do not intervene. They don't say to a state, bring in these, don't bring in the others, don't let this. There are all sorts of international conventions. They're usually far from reality, and they do not compel introduction of refugees who escape because of the war, but only of political persecutions. This was developed after the Second World War, and the interests of the state did not adjust that usually the refugees are either as a result of war or maybe hunger or persecutions, and therefore international law today actually compels us to open the gate when a person comes in because of the covenant against torture. Namely, if somebody is in danger in his own country because of torture, then you have to let him in. And here again, in order to be accurate, the universal law compels the entry. It doesn't say it has to give the status of a refugee. If people knew that, it would help the state of Israel to make this resolution whether to let them in or not. You have to let him in because he's in danger, but you do not have to give him the full rights of a political refugee, which is a sort of a bridge of entry to be a citizen. What are you threatened? You're not threatened by scores of people who will come here, but what will happen is that Gentiles are going to come here, Goyim, and we are a Jewish state. Had you knew the international law, you would realize that the international law only compels you to a temporary asylum. Allow people to get in and solve all the problems later. We'll see, you're not committed to give them any rights. You're allowed to give it if you want, but you can give it to others, even according to the rules of the game of the international law, but you have to know it. Namely, just international law as a word can take me to the total protection of a person without the interest of the state. This is not knowing the law. And the last thing is the legal aspects of a war. What is compelled and what is not. Here, because of the development of international law, following the challenge that Yedidia sent me, I spoke to some of my colleagues in the faculty. And then I was told that in commercial law, the development is not the same as in human rights. And a great change happened here as of the year 2000 because of the Intifada. The High Court of Law started ignoring completely all the rules of the international law. We kept talking about humanitarian law, of the ethical aspects. The Geneva Convention does have, that is instilled in the territory. If it's not, is it relevant? Is it not? Many years, all in all, the High Court of Law evaded then to actually learn these things. But as of the year 2000, in a very consistent way, the court talks about humanitarian law as something which is present within the legal commitment of the behavior of the army. And it requires the system to align itself, and the requirements are in a very harsh situation. And I said that from Zion, the law will come out as well, because the court has to implement all that in conditions of war, not a war between states, but in asymmetrical war, and all the complexity that we have here in this country. The court of law is committed to find solutions to this very complex situation that the classical universal law does not give it. And by that, not only that it raised the state of Israel to a high level of moral, but it's also a light unto the nations in this respect. So everything is great. That's wonderful. Where do I see the problem then? of the thesis that I said in the beginning, that not everything is compelling of the international law. And that's the additional point, where international organizations today, when they require during fighting the level of ethics, they are talking not just about the humanitarian law, but also the human rights of the international law. Now, the general human law of universal rights, it's important, but it's a different story. It's a different kettle of fish. It compels a country towards its citizens, even during war, but it's not in order to arrange the situation of the citizens of the enemy, or the injured of the enemy, or those who actually were captive. And the moment you make this additional step without knowing that this is not what the universal law requires from you, you may instill on a state, and in this case Israel, some sort of wrong values or levels of moral, and create a really harsh problem. And therefore what I'm saying is, yes, we must abide by the international law, but in order to know it well, it requires us to know exactly what the sections say and to be very accurate about what it says. And that really can help us a lot to the moral resilience of the State of Israel.